Are you ready to have all of your mixing questions solved in just this one video? Well, I can do that by helping you understand the 7 characteristics of sound. Keep watching. Hey, I'm Reagan Rand with OrpheusAudioAcademy.com, helping you make better music and grow your fan base online. I know that's a pretty audacious promise that I just offer at the beginning of this video, but stick with me. You'll see what I mean as I go through this video. So often as producers or mixers, we get so bogged down in all the technical side of things or all the different hacks we've watched on YouTube or strategies and so on that we can kind of lose focus of the big picture. So this video is designed to help you get back that big picture that's going to help you become a better mixer. Michelangelo once said that every block of stone has a statue inside of it, and it is the task of the sculptor to discover it. Well, I think we can say the same thing when it comes to our DAWs, right? Every blank DAW project has a beautiful audio masterpiece hidden inside it, and it's our job to just carve away all the unnecessary stuff to reveal that sculpture hidden within. So that's how you want to think of yourself. Think of yourself as a sonic sculptor. Don't think of yourself as a music producer or an audio engineer. You are a sonic sculptor. You're sculpting sound. But before you sculpt anything, you have to understand what material it is that you're working with. Are you working with marble or stone? What is it that you are working with? You have to understand that first before you can go about sculpting it. And that's what this video is going to cover. And those are the 7 characteristics of sound. So the first characteristic of sound is frequency. Sound is very much like waves on an ocean. So you can think of frequency as the rate at which waves are washing up on a beach. So frequency is how fast or how slow then those waves are arriving on that beach. Or in more sonic terms, frequency is the rate at which a sound wave completes a cycle. So a cycle is when a sound wave goes up to a peak and then down to a trough. So if you remember learning about waves in your 8th grade science class, it applies to sound waves, not just ocean waves. So every time a wave goes from up to down and back to up, it has completed one cycle, and the rate at which sound waves are cycling creates different tones or pitches. So you can really think of frequency as just being another term for pitch. And our human ears can only hear so many pitches, right? On the low end, we can hear at 20 hertz about. Beyond that, we can't really hear. Even at 30 and down, right? A lot of people might not be able to hear those frequencies. And then the high end, our hearing goes up to 20,000 hertz. So between 20 and 20,000 hertz, that is our hearing range. So then frequency is really important to your audio masterpiece that you're sculpting because sounds can only fit in so many places within that frequency spectrum. And you want to make sure everything has a place. You don't want sounds to be stacked up on top of each other because then they start to clash and you lose clarity. You can't really hear what's going on with any one of those sounds because they're all fighting to compete for that same frequency range. We measure frequency in terms of cycles per second. So remember those cycles we talked about? A hertz equals 1 cycle per second. So 1,000 hertz would be 1,000 cycles per second. So the sound wave is going up and down 1,000 times every second. That is frequency. So moving on to number 2, the second important characteristic of sound is amplitude. Going back to our ocean example, the frequency is how fast or how slow the waves are arriving on the beach. Then amplitude is how high the waves are, how big the waves are. Or more common terms, amplitude is simply volume, how loud or how soft a sound source is. And amplitude is measured in decibels, which is often just shortened to dB. So that's another important aspect of your track is what sounds are going to be your loud sounds, what sounds are going to be quiet, and how do those change over time, right? You don't want just to have a static mix. You want things to be getting quieter and louder over time, while at the same time remaining fairly consistent, right? That's a big part of professional quality music today is that a lot of the dynamics are kind of pushed out. Things are kept very consistent over time over the course of a song, but you still want to have some dynamics in there as well. Now, the third important sound characteristic that you want to consider is timbre. Although it looks like it should be pronounced timbre, but it's actually pronounced timbre. And so timbre is just a fancy word for tone or the color of a sound. So timbre is why two different instruments can be playing the exact same sound, the exact same frequency, or the exact same note, the exact same frequency, but they sound completely different. This is because no sound is really played in isolation unless you're using like a perfect sound wave on that spectrum. But usually every sound, right, it's going to have maybe its fundamental note that it's playing, its fundamental frequency, but it's going to have other subtle frequencies spread throughout the spectrum. These are called harmonics. So it's these different harmonics that color the sound. And so when you have different plugins like compressors or different saturation plugins that are designed to color your sound, what they're doing is they're adding in different harmonics around that fundamental note, which are changing the tonal character of your sound. And so that is timbre, another important thing to think about when you are making your sonic sculpture. Now, a fourth sound element to think about is the envelope of a sound.
That was called an envelope. Some people called it an envelope. Those people were lunatics.
The envelope, this is also known as an ADSR envelope. An envelope is comprised of four elements, which are the attack, decay, sustain, and release. So attack is simply how quickly a sound reaches its peak volume. So if it has a fast attack, then it's immediately reaching its peak volume. If it has a slow attack, then your sound is ramping up to its peak volume. Then you have decay, which is how quickly your sound then, after it reaches its peak, it drops to what is called the sustain level. So sustain is the consistent volume that your sound sits at after decay until the note is released. So when you hold down a note, first attack comes in, so how fast is it going to reach its peak volume? Then after that, decay takes over, which is how long it then takes to decay from its peak volume down to your sustain volume. And then when you release the key, then release, the fourth element of your envelope, takes over, which is how quickly the sound then fades to nothing after you've released that note. So that's another big element of your song, right? Every sound has an envelope, and so you're going to be balancing all these different envelopes to create different types of sounds in your arrangement. Now, a fifth sonic element you want to keep in mind is velocity. So velocity is the speed at which sound travels. Now sound actually travels at different speeds depending on a lot of different factors. So this is kind of more relevant for if you're doing like live work, but humidity, density, and temperature can all affect the speed of sound. But in general, here are some good measurements. So sound travels at 1,127 feet per second, or 767.54 miles per hour. This really is only relevant for mixing when you're setting up delays and reverb, if you're wanting to recreate a certain rate at which a song is decaying or reverberating. So this one isn't as important as maybe some of the other ones. Now, the sixth characteristic of sound is the wavelength, and this is simply the distance between successive crests on the sound wave. Again, this one is not as important generally. This really just comes into effect when you are maybe doing editing or you're trying to, like line up vocals. Then you really got to pay attention to the wavelength so that you can line up your different sound waves so that, say, all your vocal stack, right, everything's hitting at the same wavelength, so they're playing at the same time. Otherwise, it's going to sound like everyone's singing out of time, not in at the same time, not in harmony with each other, which is going to sound for a messy sound. This is also important when it comes to the seventh and final sound characteristic, which is phase. Phase is defined as how far along its cycle a given waveform is. Now, phase really factors in as a problem that you're wanting to avoid, specifically sounds being out of phase with each other. So your concern with having sounds being out of phase is that they can actually cancel each other out. So again, you're thinking of those waveforms, right? So if you have, right, two sounds, like two recordings of the same sound source, like say you use two mics, or you have the sound duplicated or something like that, then again, you want those waveforms to match up. You want the peaks and troughs to match. If they are opposite, right, if you've one doing a peak while one's doing a trough, they will actually cancel each other out. And so when things are out of phase, in your mix, you can actually completely lose them when you're listening in mono. So that's another thing to consider when you're mixing, is to be mixing in mono, so you can make sure that things aren't out of phase and you're not losing certain sounds. So how do these 7 sound characteristics come into play when mixing? Well, I think one of the big mistakes that beginning producers make is trying to rely too much on formulas or hacks or certain tactics when it comes to mixing, and losing the big picture of you're really just throwing these 7 characteristics of sound into a bowl and you're trying to mix them up so you can create the best combination. So you're losing that big picture when you're trying to just rely on all these different formulas. So rather than thinking, how do I compress blank, or how do I EQ this instrument, instead you want to think about, what are you hearing? Which of these 7 sound characteristics are you hearing that needs adjusted? For example, as you listen back, you might, instead of thinking, how do I volume balance everything, right? Just use your ears and you think, is there any particular sound that sounds too loud in comparison to everything else, right? That's amplitude. Or maybe your track is sounding too dark or too muddy, right? Now you're dealing with tone and frequency, because those low mid-range sounds is where you get that mud. And so now you have to, that's when you can say, now I'm going to go to my tools, my sculpting tools, and your EQ is your paintbrush or your hammer and chisel, basically, to sculpt that sound down so you can then carve out that offending frequency. Or maybe you have a particular synth sound that is taking too long to ramp up to its peak volume. You want it to be snappier. Then that's where you adjust the envelope. Maybe you increase the attack. Maybe you decrease the sustain, so that you have more room now for your other sounds, since it's not dragging out over your timeline. So in summary, rather than trying to remember different formulas or strategies for how do you EQ or compress different instruments, keep in mind these 7 characteristics of sound, and when you are listening back to your track to inform your mixing decisions, and then you never have to wonder, hey, how do I EQ this? How do I compress that? Because in the end, there's really no formula. There's no right answers, because it really just comes down to taste a lot of times, and what do you want your song to sound like? And so that's where keeping in mind these 7 characteristics is so vital for crafting the sound you want. All right, and so now with these in mind, if you're wanting to finish more songs faster, then I highly recommend you grab my free rapid song finishing checklist in the description below. This will walk you through a proven step-by-step process for mixing, so you never have to wonder, what do I do next when you're going through the mixing process? This will help you finish more songs faster so you can get more music released. Otherwise, drop a like if you found this video helpful, and feel free to subscribe so you don't miss any new tutorials like this that I release on this channel. Question of the video: which of these 7 characteristics would you like me to cover in more detail in a future tutorial? Let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, have an awesome day, and I'll see you in a future video. Bye.